Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm looking at Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, and in particular I'm going to analyse the character of Mr Rushworth. Poor Mr Rushworth. Or is he poor Mr Rushworth? We'll see. In the closing stages of the novel, Mrs Rushworth, Maria Bertram as was, and Henry Crawford have an affair and abscond together. Clearly, they are both to blame for this. But does Mansfield Park's narrative voice suggest that Mr Rushworth shares any of the blame or guilt for the failure of his marriage? To outline then how this video is going to unfold. So I'm going to go through the novel chronologically at key moments when Mr Rushworth appears, to interrogate whether the narrative voice suggests any culpability, blameworthiness or guilt in the language of the novel on the part of Mr Rushworth. I'm also going to interrogate whether or not we should sympathise with or pity him. So I'm going to start with the introduction of Mr Rushworth as a character. I'm then going to look at the Sotherton episode. Sotherton is his grand estate. I'm then going to look at the debacle of the Lovers Vows scenes and his responses to them. And then I'm going to look at the return of Sir Thomas Bertram to Mansfield. I'm then going to look at the description of the couple's motivations for actually getting married when they get there in Volume 2. And then I'm going to close by considering the narrative voice's summary of Mr Rushworth in the final chapter. Mr Rushworth, Mr James Rushworth. Once only in the novel is his forename mentioned, and he is referred to by his mother as James. So Mr James Rushworth is very pleased with himself and is aided and abetted in this self-satisfaction by his mother. Mr Rushworth is also clearly incredibly stupid, and the narrative voice mocks him but also seems to quite enjoy poking fun at his stupidity. We're told, for example, that he scarcely risked an original thought of his own in chapter 10. And Edmund Bertram, for example, considering his sister's recent engagement to Mr Rushworth, could not refrain from often saying to himself in Mr Rushworth's company, "If this man had not 12,000 a year, he would be a very stupid fellow." Well, Edmund should observe, you would have thought, that he is a very stupid fellow, regardless of how much money he has. And perhaps this gives us a little insight into the materialism that pervades the Bertram family. But does Mr Rushworth's palpable stupidity excuse him in the eyes of Jane Austen's narrative voice? Section 1. Our introduction to Mr Rushworth. The reader's introduction to Mr Rushworth, the first mention of him in the novel Mansfield Park, is revealing in terms of his relationship with Maria Bertram. Mr Rushworth was from the first struck with the beauty of Miss Bertram, and being inclined to marry, soon fancied himself in love, we're told in chapter 4. And this is the extent of the reasons that we are given for why Mr Rushworth has engaged himself to Maria Bertram, because she is beautiful. This is his primary, and it seems frankly his only, reason for seeking to marry her. There is no suggestion that he values her for any other reason, and certainly not for her character. In fact, at no point in the novel does Mr Rushworth state anything specific that he likes or admires or values in the woman he gets himself engaged to. There is also an implication in this sentence introducing Mr Rushworth to readers that her feelings are not really part of his thinking, or perhaps rather his convenience and inclinations are what he thinks of first and foremost. He is inclined to marry, and therefore it is convenient for him to fancy himself in love with a woman that he happens to find beautiful, or that is proclaimed to be beautiful, as if that's all he's looking for in a wife. And the phrasing of the description, the beauty of Miss Bertram, is disconcertingly formal and impersonal. Compare Mr Rushworth being struck with the beauty of Miss Bertram, for example, to Mr Darcy's detailed contemplation of Elizabeth Bennet's handsomeness in Pride and Prejudice. So there, Darcy thinks, no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, that's Lizzie Bennet's face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. So there are plenty of specifics here. He thinks of her as uncommon, so sort of out of the ordinary in some way, that she has an intelligence about her, or a sort of beautiful, intelligent expression. And, beautiful, intelligent expression is a very different way of talking about someone being beautiful than simply the beauty of Miss Bertram. Darcy never thinks in those impersonal terms of the beauty of Elizabeth Bennet. No, he's focused on the specifics, that she's out of the ordinary, her expression, that she has dark eyes even. He's noticed, some specifics about what he thinks is beautiful about her, which is just not the case with Mr Rushworth and Maria. So the introduction of Mr Rushworth is such a kind of revealingly structured sentence by Jane Austen, I think. The swiftness of the movement within the sentence, from first thoughts to marriage and love, one very short sentence, this all kind of moves through. It's kind of comically compressed, and it comically draws attention to Mr Rushworth's lack of any proper thinking, and therefore his foolishness. Section 2. The scene at Sotherton. The novel moves to Sotherton, the grand estate of Mr Rushworth. Mr Rushworth, Maria Bertram and Henry Crawford are walking in the grounds, and they encounter a locked gate. But they want to adventure beyond it. Mr Rushworth wished he had brought the key. He had been very near thinking whether he should not bring the key. He was determined he would never come without the key again. But still, this did not remove the present evil. Chapter 10. This sentence shows the dry wryness of the narrative voice. All the protestations of Mr Rushworth cannot remove the present evil of the gate remaining locked. So here the narrative voice uses indirect discourse. Indirect discourse is where the narrative voice reports the speech, or reports someone's speech without actually quoting it, and often condenses and summarises a character's speech, as here with Mr Rushworth. The indirect discourse structure of the sentence undermines Mr Rushworth's protestations, almost as if his actual words were not worth quoting in full. The narrative voice has summarised Mr Rushworth's inanities, compressed them into a coherent sentence, but gets to the point, one presumes, quicker than Mr Rushworth had himself. In its stylistic construction, then, we can see that the narrative voice understands Mr Rushworth's pointless babble in a way that he does not himself. And the compression again adds to the comedy. The point is that he does not have the key. His repeated exclamations on not having the key only make him seem more silly. And his ridiculousness is exacerbated by the terseness of the narrative voice's reformation of his words. Mr Rushworth duly rushes back to the house to get the key, and when he returns to the gate he finds that Maria Bertram and Henry Crawford have snuck round the gate and are wandering in the park grounds. So Mr Rushworth then complains to Fanny Price, who happens to be sitting on a bench next to the gate, about what has happened. Though she, Fanny, made the best of the story, he was evidently mortified and displeased in no common degree. At first he scarcely said anything, his looks only expressed his extreme surprise and vexation, and he walked to the gate and stood there without seeming to know what to do. After another pause he went on, "Pray, Miss Price, are you such a great admirer of this Mr Crawford as some people are? For my part, I can see nothing in him." "I do not think him at all handsome," replies Fanny. "Handsome? Nobody can call such an undersized man handsome. He is not 5'9". I should not wonder if he is not more than 5'8". I think he is an ill-looking fellow. In my opinion, these Crawfords are no addition at all. We did very well without them." A small sigh escaped Fanny here, and she did not know how to contradict him. Mr Rushworth protests too much, and so reveals that he is aware of and niggled by Henry Crawford's attractive appeal, especially to Maria, evidence of his growing jealousy. And I use jealousy here to mean vigilance in guarding a possession, or what one considers at least to be a possession, and the state of mind arising from the suspicion, apprehension of, or knowledge of rivalry, and these are from the Oxford English Dictionary. So Mr Rushworth asks, "Pray, Miss Price, are you such a great admirer of this Mr Crawford as some people are?" Clearly, although obliquely, referring to Maria. He is obviously aware that Maria is a great admirer of Henry. And like many a jealous lover, he does not see the appeal of the rival. For my part, I can see nothing in him. Mr Rushworth's criticism of Henry Crawford, that he cannot be considered handsome because he is too short, apparently, is worth noting. Nobody can call such an undersized man handsome. He is not more than 5'8". 5'8", by the way, is about 172, 173 centimetres. As the footnotes to the Cambridge University Press edition of Mansfield Park note, the point of this is that gentlemen were normally several inches taller than men of lower social standing because of the differences in nutrition, in healthy air, in exercise, and so on. And we can see this class-based disparity in height in the Regency period, for instance, in a comparison of officer class recruits, so those going to Sandhurst, the British Army Military Academy for officers, and the underclass, for want of a better word, recruits, those going into the Marine Society, many of whom were recruited as boys from the London slums. In 1810, of boys of the same age, there was a disparity of about 15 centimetres between those of the upper officer class, who were on average about 157 centimetres, and those of the lower class, who were on average about 141 centimetres. Now, these are boys of 14, so it's a bit different, but we should remember that Henry Crawford is 172 about centimetres, so a good 15 centimetres taller again. We might note also that in Mansfield Park the heights of the female cousins are explicitly compared. So the higher status Maria and Julia Bertram are both physically robust and are tall of their age, we're told in chapter 2, whereas lower class and physically weaker Fanny Price is small of her age. By claiming that Henry Crawford is undersized, although, as I've already suggested, he's really not, it seems, compared to the averages of the time. But by claiming that Henry Crawford was undersized, Mr Rushworth is not just making an aesthetic point. It could be argued that he is also trying to imply some kind of social inferiority too. And this would further reveal to readers Mr Rushworth's self-importance when it comes to his own very grand social status, because he is so very rich. He is the wealthiest character in Austen's novel. So he is worth £12,000 per annum. For comparison, Mr Darcy, for example, is worth £10,000 per year. The Rushworths are so rich, and Sotherton is such a remunerative estate, that they can look down on Henry Crawford's Everingham estate, which brings in £4,000 a year. That is rich. £4,000 a year is what John Dashwood, for example, receives from the Norland estate in Sense and Sensibility. And in Pride and Prejudice, for example, Mr Bingley has about 4,000 or 5,000 a year, and that is riches beyond Mrs Bennet's kind of wildest imagination. We can see this quiet but nonetheless present snobbery in Mrs Rushworth, which we can imagine her son to have inherited, given that we know that the mother holds great sway over the son. Mrs Rushworth's lessening of Henry Crawford's social and financial status is evident in conversation with Mrs Norris. This is when Mrs Norris imagines that Henry Crawford will marry Julia Bertram. So Mrs Norris sort of suggests this, and Mrs Rushworth says in response, "Miss Julia and Mr Crawford? Yes, indeed, a very pretty match. What is his property?" 4,000 a year, Mrs Norris responds. To which Mrs Rushworth condescendingly observes, at least I read her words as being sneering, "Very well. Those who have not more must be satisfied with what they have. 4,000 a year is a pretty estate, and he seems a very genteel, steady young man, so I hope Miss Julia will be very happy." She's clearly not a great judge of character if she thinks that Henry Crawford is a very genteel, steady young man. I definitely would not call him steady, anything but. The point that I think is interesting here is that she begins, "Very well, those who have not more must be satisfied with what they have." This is sort of nonsense, really. I mean, it applies to anyone. Those who have not more must be satisfied with what they have. Well, sort of anyone must be satisfied with what they have. I mean, Mr Rushworth must be satisfied with what he has. In kind of equal measure to Henry Crawford, at least. And it exposes, I think, that Mrs Rushworth's kind of immediate thought is that her family's estate property brings in more. Those who have not more. It seems to me that this is superiority dressed up as wisdom. And Mrs Rushworth speaks as though £4,000 per year were something that one must be merely satisfied with. I mean, for another comparison, Colonel Brandon in Sense and Sensibility, for example, has half of that, £2,000 per year, which Marianne Dashwood considers to be enough to enable a proper establishment, and Eleanor Dashwood considers to be wealth. And that's only half of what Henry Crawford has. Furthermore, in the next sentence, Mrs Rushworth's diction is revealing in the word pretty. 4,000 a year is a pretty estate. Pretty here has a contemptuous tone, a quality of diminution. It is, I think, dismissive whilst apparently maintaining a degree of politeness. So Romantic poet John Keats, for example, was incredibly offended when, at a similar kind of time to when Mansfield Park was published, when William Wordsworth had said of a poem of Keats's that it is a very pretty piece. And Keats kind of understood that that was incredibly dismissive to say that it was a very pretty piece. So the use of the word pretty, although it might seem polite, is actually dismissive and kind of lessening the value of. Just again, for another kind of point of comparison, regarding the Mansfield estate. So readers are told in the very opening sentence that on marrying Sir Thomas, Lady Bertram now has all the comforts and consequences of a handsome house and large income. So that's all we're told. So we don't kind of know on the scale where the Bertrams are between Mr Rushworth and Henry Crawford. We just know that it's large. But all this is to say that the Rushworths seem to look down on Henry Crawford's lower financial and, in their eyes, social status, and that Mr Rushworth's jibe about Henry Crawford's height has potentially snobbish undertones. Mr Rushworth can put Henry Crawford down over social status, knowing that there, at least, he has the upper hand. Mr Rushworth's palpable dislike of Henry Crawford and potential worry about him and Maria continues when the Bertram party are leaving Sotherton. So the narrative voice makes a sly dig at Mr Rushworth's complacency, meaning his self-satisfaction, when he assists Maria into the carriage. He, Mr Rushworth, was certainly better pleased to hand her, Maria, into the barouche than to assist her in ascending the box, and his complacency seemed confirmed by the arrangement. So it is Henry's barouche. In a barouche, two couples sit facing each other in the main body of the carriage. This is where Maria is sitting. And on the box up front, there was room for the driver, Henry, and a companion, Julia Bertram. So Henry and Maria are separated by the travelling arrangements, which pleases Mr Rushworth. In using the word complacency, the narrative voice is laying the groundwork for the idea that Mr Rushworth views the competition with Henry Crawford over Maria as concerned with his own self-satisfaction and the puffing up of his ego. Section 3. The Lovers Vows debacle. Lovers Vows was a very popular, frequently performed play translated by Elizabeth Inchbold and published in 1798. It went through multiple editions within the first year of its being published, so you can see that it was popular. And it was performed, for example, several times in Bath when Jane Austen was staying in Bath also. Maria Bertram is to play Agatha, and Henry Crawford is to play Frederick. One of the reasons why the play is problematic for Fanny Price and for Edmund Bertram, certainly initially, is because Agatha and Frederick are mother and bastard son. So she was seduced by the father with the promise of marriage. He then didn't marry her, foreshadowing upcoming events in the novel Mansfield Park. So mother and son meet up again in the first scene. So this is Act 1 of Lovers Vows, after 5 years apart, and they are demonstrative in their affection for each other. And we can see just by looking at the stage directions from the play Lovers Vows how physically intimate they are. Agatha rising and embracing him, he leans her head against his breast. Frederick, with his eyes cast down, takes her hand and puts it to his heart. Now, rehearsing this moment is very important in terms of the development of the novel Mansfield Park. So on Sir Thomas's return, Henry Crawford keeps pressing Maria's, or Frederick keeps pressing Agatha's hand to his heart. And it's this sort of rehearsal / real life, Maria isn't too sure, and it's that moment that convinces Maria that Henry intends to marry her. So the text then reads, Henry Crawford's retaining her hand at such a moment of such peculiar proof and importance, was worth ages of doubt and anxiety. She hailed it as an earnest, so that means a promise, of the most serious determination, and was equal even to encounter her father. Maria Bertram, therefore, elides rehearsals and her real feelings. She confuses what's acting and what's real. Or you could say that Henry Crawford deliberately exploits and makes fuzzy the difference between those two. So it is explicitly this rehearsing of these physical intimacies that directly leads to Maria believing that Henry Crawford is going to ask her to marry him, and everything that follows as a result. So these physical intimacies that they engage in are really integral to the development of the plot of Mansfield Park. But to get back to the stage direction, so he embraces her, she presses him to her breast. This physical intimacy, which they rehearse ad infinitum, seemingly, was in the Regency period highly improper and just not appropriate. I can't kind of convey how improper polite society would consider this to be at the time. It would be improper for an engaged couple. It would be improper for Mr Rushworth and Maria Bertram to be behaving like this. So being publicly, physically intimate before marriage. But for unattached people like Henry and Maria, it would be verging on indecent. In the words of Fanny Price, when she first reads through the script, Agatha appeared to her so totally improper, so unfit to be expressed by any woman of modesty. It is so improper that Mr Rushworth ought to notice immediately. But we are told, at least initially, that Mr Rushworth is too enamoured with his own costume to worry about anything else. This is even though Maria Bertram herself is worried about Mr Rushworth's reaction. Mr Rushworth liked the idea of his finery very well, though affecting to despise it, and was too much engaged with what his own appearance would be to think of the others, or draw any of those conclusions, or feel any of that displeasure which Maria had been half prepared for. Mr Rushworth is too distracted by himself, too distracted by thinking of his own costume and his number of speeches, 42, to draw any conclusions or feel any displeasure. Even Maria herself expects Mr Rushworth to notice her behaviour and disapprove of her behaviour with Henry Crawford, perhaps suggesting that readers ought to expect that of him too. The narrative voice reiterates Mr Rushworth's self-absorption, that he had been too much engaged with himself to think of the others later in the chapter, by observing that Mr Rushworth, having only his own part and his own dress in his head, had soon talked away all that could be said of either. So the narrative voice offers no sympathy towards Mr Rushworth. Instead, readers are reminded that he is self-obsessed and dull about it. From Fanny Price's observations of events and her terror of what Mr Rushworth might feel, the reader gets a sense that the narrative voice is suggesting through Fanny Price's observations that Mr Rushworth ought to be voicing his concerns, both about Maria Bertram's evident avoidance of him and the frequent and determined physical intimacies between Maria and Henry Crawford that the play encourages. She, Fanny, knew also that poor Mr Rushworth. Is he poor Mr Rushworth? Fanny seems to be much more kindly towards Mr Rushworth than the narrative voice is. Poor Mr Rushworth could seldom get anybody to rehearse with him. His complaint came before her as well as the rest, and so decided to her eye was her cousin Maria's avoidance of him, and so needlessly often the rehearsal of the first scene between her and Mr Crawford, the physical intimacies, that she had soon all the terror of other complaints from him, that is, Mr Rushworth. So the link between Mr Rushworth's voiced complaint that no one will rehearse with him and Fanny's observation that Maria is rehearsing continually instead with Henry Crawford is implied. If Fanny has realised that Maria is deliberately avoiding Mr Rushworth and is choosing instead to rehearse so needlessly often, and this is in the thinking of Fanny Price, who kind of often goes out of her way to try and be at least sympathetic, poor Mr Rushworth, to rehearse so needlessly often with Henry Crawford, then surely Mr Rushworth ought to be aware of it too. And so we have both Maria herself and Fanny perhaps implying that he should be voicing his concerns. In the very next paragraph, indeed, Mr Rushworth's awareness of Henry Crawford comes to the fore. The day came at last when Mr Rushworth turned to her, Fanny, with a black look and said, "Do you think there is anything so very fine in all this? For the life and soul of me, I cannot admire him. And between ourselves, to see such an undersized, little, mean-looking man set up for a fine actor is very ridiculous, in my opinion." From this moment, there was a return of his former jealousy, which Maria, from increasing hopes of Crawford, was at little pains to remove, and the chances of Mr Rushworth's ever attaining to the knowledge of his 42 speeches became much less. Again, Mr Rushworth attacks Mr Crawford's height. He is apparently undersized and little. Mr Rushworth's jealousy is made explicit. His former jealousy, stoked by the incident at Sotherton, returns. So Maria Bertram's preference for Henry Crawford is clear, and she is not even at pains to remove Mr Rushworth's jealousy. Now, we might think that this should encourage sympathy from the reader. After all, Maria and Henry have behaved badly. But not even an instant of sympathy is permitted by the narrative voice. Fanny might call him poor Mr Rushworth, but the narrative voice does not. From the moment of the return of his former jealousy, the narrative voice observes, the chance of his remembering his character's 42 speeches becomes much less. Comic undercutting by immediately, and remember that this is all within one sentence, the revelation of his jealousy and his response to it, that he's not going to be able to remember his speeches. So by immediately referring to something that had characterised Mr Rushworth kind of previously, characterised his pompous absurdity, the narrative voice ridicules rather than pities him. There is no pathos here. Later, Mary Crawford visits Fanny Price in the East Room, Fanny Price's sanctuary up in the East Room, and mentions the physical intimacy of the rehearsing mother and son, witnessed by her and Mr Rushworth. The scene is so compromising that Mary has to explain it away to Mr Rushworth, and she tries harder to curb his jealousy than Maria does. The theatre is engaged, of course, by those two indefatigable rehearsers, Agatha and Frederick. If they are not perfect, I shall be surprised. By the by, I looked in upon them 5 minutes ago, and it happened to be exactly at one of those times when they were trying not to embrace. And Mr Rushworth was with me. I thought he began to look a little queer. Queer here meaning unwell, giddy, faint. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. So I turned it off as well as I could by whispering to him, "We shall have an excellent Agatha. There is something so maternal in her manner, so completely maternal in her voice and countenance. Was not that well done of me?" He brightened up directly. Mr Rushworth's queer look means that he has definitely noticed the impropriety and that he recognises that something is wrong. I dwell on this because it is made clear that almost every character, Fanny Price, Mary Crawford, Edmund Bertram and Julia Bertram elsewhere, but they too, and even Maria herself, is aware that Maria Bertram's conduct is improper and that her preference for Henry Crawford over Mr Rushworth is obvious, palpable and embarrassing. And what's more, that readers are told unambiguously of Mr Rushworth's explicit jealousy demonstrates that he is aware of his betrothed's preference for another. Mr Rushworth's jealousy matters in terms of determining his guilt in getting married. His blameworthiness is tangible from the very moment of Sir Thomas Bertram's return to Mansfield. Section 4. What does the return of Sir Thomas Bertram reveal about Mr Rushworth? Volume 2 opens. How is the consternation of the party to be described? To the greater number, it was a moment of absolute horror. Sir Thomas in the house, but Mr Rushworth might imagine it a blessing. Why might Mr Rushworth imagine the return of Sir Thomas to be a blessing? Because now the wedding between him and Maria Bertram can go ahead. But any sensible thinking person should not consider it a blessing to have to wait for a father to return to force or persuade an unhappy, or at least an uncommitted daughter into marrying you. And in the narrative voice's use of the word might, however, we get a hint that things are not going to be entirely rosy. Not very much of a blessing, whatever Mr Rushworth might imagine. On the first night that Sir Thomas Bertram returns to Mansfield, Mr Rushworth again mentions Henry Crawford's apparently small stature. The Bertrams and Mr Rushworths are all sitting around in the evening talking, and Tom Bertram comments to his father about Henry Crawford that Mr Crawford is a most pleasant, gentlemanlike man. Mr Rushworth could be silent no longer. I do not say he is not gentlemanlike, considering. There is rather a condescending tone to Mr Rushworth's considering. But you should tell your father he is not above 5'8", or he will be expecting a well-looking man. Sir Thomas did not quite understand this and looked with some surprise at the speaker. If I must say what I think, continued Mr Rushworth, in my opinion, it is very disagreeable to be always rehearsing. It is having too much of a good thing. I am not so fond of acting as I was at first. I think we are a great deal better employed sitting comfortably here among ourselves. There doesn't seem to be a segue between those two, or a kind of obvious segue, apart from the fact that Mr Rushworth is associating Henry Crawford and his being 5'8" only, and that it is very disagreeable to be always rehearsing. And this shows that psychologically, he links those two together. He had been well aware of the behaviour of the two indefatigable rehearsers. His response is to be jealous of Henry Crawford rather than to address Maria herself. Maria, after all, is the one he is marrying and therefore the person that he should be concerned about. Instead, he feels himself to be in competition with Henry Crawford. Section 5. Mr Rushworth is impatient for marriage. How does the narrative voice describe the couple's motivations that bring about their big day? The narrative voice is scathing of Maria Bertram's reasons and explains all her terrible motives. In all the important preparations of the mind she was complete, being prepared for matrimony by a hatred of home, restraint and tranquillity, by misery of disappointed affection. Henry Crawford has abandoned her by now. He abandoned her, kind of immediately that Sir Thomas returned. And contempt of the man she was to marry. So much for her motives. The narrative voice also notes, however, that Mr Rushworth could hardly be more impatient for the marriage than herself. She is impatient for all the wrong reasons, as we know. But by linking their impatience together in this sentence, the narrative voice implies that his impatience to marry is similarly for all the wrong reasons. But what are these reasons? Why is Mr Rushworth so impatient to marry a woman who he knows, and which the text has made it clear that he knows, does not love him, or even like him? The text leaves it for the reader to consider until we get to the third and final volume. Section 6. Fanny Price's Recollections of the Rehearsals, in Volume 3. The narrative, through Fanny Price's observations to Edmund Bertram on why she cannot marry Henry Crawford, refers again explicitly to Mr Rushworth's jealousy. As a bystander, said Fanny, perhaps I saw more than you did, and I do think that Mr Rushworth was sometimes very jealous. And Edmund responds, very possibly, no wonder. Nothing could be more improper than the whole business. I am shocked whenever I think that Maria could be capable of it. Yes, Maria's improper behaviour is mentioned by Edmund, but I do think it's worth noting that the reader's attention is drawn yet again to Mr Rushworth's jealousy, explicitly, when it really doesn't need to be. It's a kind of extraneous observation in terms of the discussion that Fanny and Edmund are having at that moment. Furthermore, Fanny even considers him to have been very jealous. So we've got a development now. And that she saw it and is willing to state that she saw it suggests how overt his jealousy was. And I think Jane Austen constructs this moment deliberately, as she had done earlier in the novel, so that the reader should be dissuaded from feeling any sympathy for Mr Rushworth and persuaded towards feeling that he shares some culpability, because he knew that something was wrong, but remained impatient to marry Maria Bertram anyway. Section 7, the final chapter, where the narrative voice states outright, having laid the seeds that I have been picking up throughout this lecture, that the reader should not sympathise with Mr Rushworth because he was cognizant of the fact that Maria Bertram loved another man, and that his impatience for marriage stemmed from a selfish passion to triumph over Henry Crawford. We're told Mr Rushworth had no difficulty in procuring a divorce. So in the Regency period, divorce required an Act of Parliament from the House of Lords, having first gone through the civil court and then through the ecclesiastical court. So it was quite a process and was very expensive. But he had no difficulty because Maria's affair and female adultery was grounds for divorce. Male adultery was not grounds for divorce, but female adultery was. And Maria's affair has been in the public sphere because it's been announced in the newspaper, which is where Mr Price and Fanny Price first kind of read about the matrimonial fracas between the Rushworths. So Mr Rushworth had no difficulty in procuring a divorce. So what's interesting, I think, here is that the narrative voice kind of explicitly mentions this, because it's putting forward the idea that, well, in the eyes of the law, Maria Bertram is completely to blame because Mr Rushworth had no difficulty in procuring a divorce. So that's the kind of end of the matter legally, publicly. That's the end of the matter. Maria Bertram is to blame, Mr Rushworth not to blame at all. So he gets his divorce very easily, and so ended a marriage contracted under such circumstances as to make any better end the effect of good luck not to be reckoned with. She had despised him and loved another, and he had been very much aware that it was so. So this is bringing a discussion of the relationship much more into the kind of internal feelings and knowledge, etc., of the couple, the two people who got married, rather than the kind of public-facing idea of having no difficulty in procuring a divorce and therefore kind of publicly assigning blame. But internally, he had been very much aware that she despised him and loved another. The indignities of stupidity and the disappointments of selfish passion can excite little pity. His punishment followed his conduct. So he was mortified and unhappy, the text tells us later. So his punishment followed his conduct, as did a deeper punishment, the deeper guilt of his wife. Yes, Mrs. Maria Rushworth shared the deeper guilt, but deeper is a comparative. It is relational. Maria's guilt is deeper, but that construction, deeper, means that Mr Rushworth shares some of the guilt too. He must share, just by the construction of the way that that's phrased. So the narrative voice makes it clear, therefore, that Mr Rushworth bears some of the guilt for the failure of the marriage. His had been a selfish passion. He was jealous of Henry Crawford, jealous of the fact that Maria loved him. So Henry Crawford was sort of antagonism towards Henry Crawford had been one of the motivations for why Maria Bertram got married to Mr Rushworth, and jealousy of Henry Crawford had been one of the motivations for why Mr Rushworth married Maria. The narrative voice uses incredibly strong diction in this final chapter. She had despised him. That's a strong way to put it. You know, not just that she didn't think very highly of him or she didn't like him very much. She had despised him, and he knew it. He was very much aware that it was so. We should not sympathise with Mr Rushworth. His behaviour, we are told, categorically in the novel's closing paragraphs, should excite no pity. Can excite little pity. You might translate as should excite, therefore no pity. Only a selfish fool would marry someone knowing that their soon-to-be spouse loved another. And only an idiot would marry someone who they knew despised them. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the thumbs up button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. And what is your view of Jane Austen's character, Mr Rushworth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.